said, well, there's been this conversation about whether Indians are slaves, and we've decided that all servants arriving by ship shall be considered servants for life if they are not Christian, but those who arrive by land shall be considered indentured servants. Well, who's arriving by ship? Africans, right? And who's arriving by land? It's Indians who they are conquering. And note, even there was that caveat then that if the servant was a Christian, they still couldn't be enslaved. And I think that was an example of compromise legislation, because Africans were voting, Indians were voting in Virginia at that time. And it wasn't until 1723 that Virginia finally passed a law that stripped Africans and Indians of the right to vote. And that's an important element of our history, because many people believe that African Americans did not get the right to vote until 1869, after the passage of the 15th Amendment. But buried within our history is 100 years of enfranchisement. And one of the things I'm proud of John Pierre is that when Philadelphia decided to disenfranchise African Americans in the 1830s, his voice was one of the loudest saying, that is wrong. We deserve the right to vote. And I am very grateful that he stood up for that. They still disenfranchised blacks, but he was there to add his voice. Now, the Founding Fathers, after the Revolution War, they debated slavery. And there's a chapter in my book, Complicated Lives, which just came out, and called National Leaders and the Anti-Slavery Slaveholding Paradox. And when I came to the Aaron Burr Association last September 29th, I had just decided to expand the conversation from the Virginia presidents who had been anti-slavery slaveholders to include Northern leaders like Aaron Burr, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, who were speaking out against slavery, and yet they owned slaves. And that was a paradox that just, you know, boggled my mind, and I wanted to show this evolution. So it just so happened, the very day I spoke, an hour before I spoke, I had sent a DNA test kit to Alan Ballard, Dr. Alan Ballard, who is the uncle of Carla Ballard Williams, several months before, and we had tested out DNA cousins. He is a third great-grandson of John Pierre Burr, and I had gone to visit him, and while I was there, I went to his archives and I read all the papers of Louisa Mitchell Allen. So this was the June of last year. And I was so impressed by the quality of her research, and I felt there was a part of me, by the time I finished going through all her papers, I thought, she is so committed to this, and I have to bring it home. It just became like the purpose of my life, to finalize her life's work to get recognition for John Pierre Burr. So I'm so happy to meet you because she was part of the inspiration for getting this done. So right before I came, so Alan and I had tested out his DNA cousins, and I had been born a Burr, and my brother and I were always told that there was something special about our family last name, but they wouldn't tell us. So we grew up. For years, we would debate whenever anything bad would go wrong in our family. My brother and I would go out and say, well, there's something special about our family. It's going to get better eventually. And so we were always like wondering what it was. And I remember once I told my brother Ralph, who's since departed this world, I said, one of these days I'm going to figure it out. And he said, I'm going to help you. And the DNA test was the final result. And the final link, because Alan had said, how do you know that we are not DNA cousins by African blood? And so I said, well, that's a good question. So I sent the test to Stuart Johnson, and just an hour before I spoke to the Aaron Burr Association, I got his results back. He's 100% European, doesn't have a single bit of African blood. And so I said to the Aaron Burr Association, wouldn't you agree that Stuart, who has no African blood, I am 96% African, I've got 1% English blood, The Burrs are English. My mom's 99% African. Wouldn't you agree that if there's a link between the two of us, it's because of Aaron Burr and Pierre Burr? They all shook their heads, and then I revealed the results, that Stuart and I were DNA cousins. Wow. And that led to the motion proposed by Frank Burr that the Aaron Burr Association recognize that Aaron Burr fathered Louisa Charlotte and Pierre Burr, and that all the descendants are legitimate members of the Burr family, descending from Jehu Burr in 1630. And it passed unanimously. Stuart was a little bit concerned when I called him up that there might be some big surprise in his DNA, but there yeah, he is like totally European. Can't get any more European than that. So, as Stuart mentioned, I was voted third vice president. And when Marks contacted us at the end of last December, he lives near here, he had noticed there was no headstone on Pierre's grave, and he said, well, you should contact the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society because they give grants, and by the way, you've got to do this in 10 days. So, being a professor, I drafted a grant proposal, which Stuart signed, and they gave us $500. But the magic in Stuart's genes is that he turned $500 into $7,000 so we could have this headstone fashioned and shipped from New Mexico to Pennsylvania and installed. The last thing I want to talk about is the broken links of heritage which affected Aaron Burr and Pierre Burr. The Africans had been in Virginia since in 1619, and the very first law that Virginia passed that mentioned Negro was in 1630. What did it say? It ordered a white man whipped for having had sex with a black woman. That was the very first law. And then there were other laws where they would order a black woman whipped for having had sex with a man. And then they would say black people and white people can't marry. So there was a pathology that was set in motion from the very beginning, which basically delegitimized all children of mixed race couples and did not allow mixed race couples to marry, which guaranteed that they would be illegitimate. And one of the things that makes me proud of this headstone is that from henceforth, I hope that Pierre Burr is never referred again as the natural son or illegitimate son of Aaron Burr, that he is simply referred to as the son of Aaron Burr. So I want to thank you for being here. And Sue is going to speak next. Did you want to introduce Sue? Stuart's going to. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah.
And by the way, Sherry is a member of the Fairfield branch of the Burr family, of the Aaron Burr family. And let me just briefly, before Sue comes up, explain that there are 4 branches of the Burr family in America. Dorchester, Massachusetts, which is in Massachusetts. The Hartford branch, which Sue Bowles is a member of. The Fairfield branch in Connecticut, which is, I think, most closely related to Aaron Burr. And the New Jersey branch, of which Frank Burr is a member. Our next presenter is Suzanne Geisler Bowles, PhD, and Sue, let me see if I get it right. Associate Professor of History.
Hey, full.
Oh, and now emeritus of history at William Patterson University in New Jersey. For decades, Sue was our vice president, our one and only vice president. And Sue stepped down in that position. She was downsizing her responsibilities last year, at which time we created 3 vice presidents, number 1, number 2, and number 3. Number 1 is Frank Burr, number 2 is Judy Gaunt, and 3 is Sherry. Sue Bowles remains as our historian. And Sue will be speaking, I believe, about the anti-slavery activities of Colonel Aaron Burr, Jr.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, here we go. I tend to speak loudly as though I didn't have a mic, so I hope I'm not overpowering. It's a great honor to be here, and I thank Sherry Burr for inviting me. When Sherry and I met last year for the first time, it turned out we had a lot of research interests in common, and I am working, it's still in the very early stages, of what I hope will be a book on Aaron Burr's anti-slavery activities in the state of New York, which I believe he has never been given the proper credit for. So that is my topic for today. On February 25th, 1785, the gradual manumission bill was being debated in the New York State Assembly. There were at that time approximately 19 to 20,000 slaves in New York. This is before 1785, so it's before we have a constitution. 29-year-old newly elected Assemblyman Aaron Burr rose to speak and proposed to amend the bill, which would have phased slavery out gradually. Burr's amendment would require, quote, the immediate and unconditional abolition of slavery. The amendment failed by a vote of 33 to 13. The initial gradual bill passed by a vote of 36 to 11. Burr and 9 other abolitionist assemblymen voted against it on the grounds that it was too weak, and that, most importantly though, if this gradual bill had passed, it would have taken away rights that free blacks already had. Sherry referred to the voting issue. Many people don't realize this today, that a number of states after the American Revolution, not all, but quite a few, did allow free blacks to vote. New York was one of them. In the 1777 state constitution, the free black males could vote, providing they met the property requirement. New York had a two-tiered system of property requirements that was somewhat complex, but they applied equally to blacks and whites. All adult black males who were free and were legal residents of New York were eligible to vote and could hold public office as well. The gradual bill would have set a date, and slave babies, not all black babies, just slave babies, in other words, babies of slave mothers, would, after this date, any babies, slave babies born after that date, would be freed when they were adults, and this was defined as the age of 22 for women and 25 for males. However, what concerned Burr more was that this bill would have, as I say, would have taken away rights that free blacks already had, not only the right to vote and hold office, but also to serve as jurors or witnesses in court cases against whites, and it would have forbade intermarriage. Burr voted against all these provisions of the gradual bill, but it passed anyway. However, it did not become law. The bill went on to the state Senate, it was passed there, but was vetoed that was in the system at that time, a law in the state of New York, law had to be finally signed off on by what was called the Council of Revision, which consisted of the governor and 2 judges. They vetoed the law on the grounds that it violated the state constitution, which it certainly did. And the veto, some people wanted, in the assembly wanted to, in the state legislature, wanted to override the veto, but they didn't have enough votes. Burr and his abolitionist cohort voted to support the veto. Up to this point in his life, Aaron Burr had made no political impact at all. He had a new family, including his wife, 2 stepsons, and a baby daughter, and his main focus was establishing a successful law practice. Interestingly, considering his subsequent career, he had been reluctant to run for assembly, but he was actually pressured into it by his wife and some lawyer friends. He only served 1 term in the assembly at that time and then went off to do other things. But gradual abolition was then put on the back burner for another 14 years, or 13 years, excuse me, when it was taken up again in 1798. Oddly enough, both Burr and his stepson, John Bartow Prevost, were elected to the assembly that year. Burr, of course, had held other offices in the meantime, in the intervening years, including Attorney General of New York and U.S. Senator. He was still an abolitionist, but in the intervening years, he had gained some experience in the legislative process, and he did vote for the Gradual Abolition Bill of 1799, largely because he realized it was the best that could be obtained under the existing terms and the political attitudes in the state of New York at that time. But more importantly, it's now 1799. The 1799 bill had no restrictions on voting, office holding, serving as a juror or a witness, or intermarriage. So Burr felt that it was not as egregious as the earlier bill, and he felt comfortable voting for it. And it did pass. The 1799 Gradual Abolition Bill in New York, under pressure from slave owners who wanted some kind of compensation in terms of years of labor and money, that was the sticking point, the compensation issue in 1799. The slave owners never did get any financial cash compensation, but they got a few extra years of labor out of the slave babies that would have been born on or after July 4th, 1799. Those babies would be freed at the age of 25 for women and 28 for men. So I don't think it's a coincidence that after a 14-year interval, the abolition of slavery, though not perfect, does get across the goal line, as it were, when Burr is back in the assembly. I want to just address briefly two other points. One Sherry has already brought up, so that I thank you for that introduction to this concept. Did Burr own slaves? Yes, he did. We can identify as many as 5, and another historian found with a combination of census records and city directories and so on, that in 1790, they did like a census of slave owners, and Aaron Burr owned 5 in 1790. But mostly, I think it was at any given time, maybe 2 or 3. As Sherry explained, this sounds so counterintuitive to us today, and certainly hypocritical. How could you be against slavery and even want its immediate abolition, but yet own slaves? You know, it's hard for us to wrap our minds around that. But as Sherry explained, Others, including John Jay, who was the president